So it's been a minute since I last spoke about the HBO show White Lotus. They came out with season 1 in 2021 and season 2 the following year, but they took a big break in between. But thankfully, I had only heard about this show about a year ago, so I was able to watch the first 2 seasons back to back. But they just recently came out with a 3rd season in February of this year. Now, I had mainly only heard about this season because people had started sharing their thoughts about it on TikTok, but I was trying my absolute best to avoid spoilers, which was getting pretty hard. So I just decided to sit down and finally watch it. And in terms of the cast, I did see 1 or 2 returning faces. We had John Grise, who plays Greg, and Natasha Rothwell, who plays Belinda, both from season 1. But Greg was also in season 2 as well for a bit. Now, there was a crap ton of new cast members, so I won't be going into the cast because I just want to get kind of into the show. So we're just going to be going through kind of the main points of the storyline. So we're dropped off right at the end of the story, much like in previous seasons. There's a man trying to do a therapy/yoga session, and all of a sudden there are gunshots ringing out, and we have absolutely no idea where they're coming from. We rewind to the top of the story where we follow the dysfunction of a family, a friendship, and a few different other relationships. Now, on the boat heading over to the White Lotus resort location in Thailand, we meet the Radcliffe family, which is Timothy and Victoria, and their 3 kids, Saxon, Piper, and Lachlan. And then we had this couple, Chelsea and Rick, who aren't really seeming to get along with Timothy Radcliffe because Rick is smoking on the boat. So we already see that Rick is a little bit of a hothead and Chelsea has to continuously be the one to calm him down. We also have our girls trip group, Jacqueline, Kate, and Lori. Jacqueline is some movie/TV star, and Kate and Lori are her 2 best friends that she grew up with. Lori is now a divorcee working at a law firm that won't make her partner after so many years working there, and Kate, I think, is a married stay-at-home mom from Texas. Belinda also comes over on the boat as well, and they arrive at the resort, and the girls trip group gets paired with Fabian for their stay. He would be the one kind of doing all the planning for their activities and such. Belinda is coming over to do some training and research to bring back to her spa at their location in Hawaii, and the Radcliffes also got someone that's similar to Fabian, but I don't really remember her name. But I remember her asking for their phones and laptops for the week, but they kind of refused at first, but we'll get into that later. The women are also getting settled in, but something is a little off with Lori. It just feels like Jacqueline and Kate are a lot closer, and there might be some jealousy there. Rick seems to be distracted as Chelsea pushes him to do some type of therapy session while they're there, but he's really there for something else, but we don't really figure out what that is until much later on in the show. We also meet Guy Talk, one of the security guards. He has this massive crush on this girl named Mook who works at the hotel as well. She's played by Lisa from the K-pop group Blackpink. I've been seeing her do a lot more acting as of late, so I'm curious to see where she's going to be taking that in the future. But back on track with the story. So it seems like she sees him more as a friend because she's more interested in more like rough and tumble men, kind of similar to the bodyguards of the owner of the resort, that's Sritala. But Guy Talk is definitely a more gentle and sweet type of guy. But for most of the season, he's just trying to change himself to be seen by Mook in a more romantic way. The Radcliffes are supposedly on the island for their daughter Piper to go to some monastery to meet a monk to write a thesis for her paper, but this turns out to be a cover-up for her basically wanting to scout out the monastery to stay there for a year instead. But much like the Mossbacher family in season 1, there's a douchey mean sibling, which is Saxon in this case. Then there's that one person that thinks they're better than their rich family because they care about the little man and other people's problems, and they think that rich people's problems are stupid. That position is given to Piper. And lastly, there's that one aloof sibling that kind of just does what everyone else tells him to do and is a pleaser and doesn't really advocate for themselves. And this season, that position is given to Lachlan. We find out when they get there that he had gotten accepted to a few different colleges, but his dad, Timothy, kind of just outrightly tells him which one he's going to be going to without considering his input. Saxon also wants him to be more manly like he is, but in reality, Saxon can't get a girl to save his life, so he keeps going to massage therapists to get off. Piper is a little nicer with her manipulation, but she's still doing the exact same thing as the rest of them. But his mom, Victoria, is kind of the only one who isn't really, because she's usually drugged up and never really knows what's going on. Rick goes to the therapy session that Chelsea had set up for him, but he's very much so grumpy about it. But eventually he ends up unloading a lot of his trauma regarding his dad being killed when he was young. Belinda starts doing her training with this employee at the resort, and they start getting pretty close, if you know what I mean. Timothy then gets a call from some journalists about a piece regarding some fraud case that was actually being built against him. And we came to find out that he was actually involved in some scheme with his friend where he, quote, only made $10 million. The fact that he said only before that number is pretty wild to me. It made me question how rich this man even was, but we never really find that out. But a day or two later, his friend that ran the scheme gets swatted by FBI agents, and they take everything, and now his friend is working with the feds. So Timothy calls his lawyer to try to figure out what to do next, but there really isn't much to do besides plead guilty to fraud and do a little time in prison. Now, of course, Timothy doesn't want to do that because that would mean his career in business and finance would be over, and how would he continue to make his millions? So eventually he gives up his phone and tells his kids to do the same with their electronics because he doesn't want to hear or see anything regarding this case. He's just tapped out. So this is when Victoria offers Timothy her pills to take because she kind of notices that he's stressing out and can't really sleep, but he's very adamant at first about not taking drugs, but then he eventually turns into a whole addict almost because he didn't want to just tell his family what he was dealing with because he felt guilty about possibly taking their luxurious life away from them. Saxon, who also works for his dad, is getting worried as well, trying to figure out why he keeps acting all weird, because if anything happens to his dad's business, he doesn't really have anything to fall back on. Things are getting weird with Jacqueline, Kate, and Lori. Now Jacqueline and Kate are talking about Lori behind her back, and then Kate ends up doing the same thing to Jacqueline with Lori talking about Jacqueline's new marriage. Why they couldn't just talk about things in the open is strange considering they're supposed to be best friends, but that's just me. Jacqueline also keeps pushing Fabian onto Lori since she's now divorced, but Lori is pretty uncomfortable with it. But things get even weirder when they start talking about politics because they find out that Kate probably voted for Trump and might be a Republican. And personally, to me, why your best friend's politics would make you so uncomfortable is interesting to me, considering y'all have been friends for decades. It just really sounds to me like y'all were never really friends to begin with, to be honest, especially when you consider the talking behind each other's backs thing. When Rick decides to start ducking out on hanging with Chelsea, that's when she meets Chloe, who's in a relationship with Greg, who's now rich because his now dead wife Tanya from season 1 and 2 had left him with a whole lot of money. Belinda then recognizes Greg from his time with Tanya in Hawaii and now passes that message on to the hotel manager Valentine, who's pretty slow when it comes to picking up what Belinda is trying to tell him. But when he finally gets it, he still doesn't really believe her. Rick decides to go to Bangkok to Sritala because we find out that it's her husband who actually allegedly killed his father years ago. And I guess he's kind of seeking revenge of some sort, but he tries to convince Chelsea before leaving that he's really just going to talk to him, but let's be real, you know? He cons his way into her house with help from his friend and convinces Sritala that he needs to come to her house under the guise of being this movie director that wants to meet her. And while she's distracted, Rick talks with her husband, Mr. Hollinger, and Rick tries to scare him into a confession, but then doesn't actually let him say anything or confess anything before he flips his chair and runs away. So that was an interesting interrogation. But what I find honestly so stupid about all that is that he runs right back to the hotel that this man literally owns. So of course he's going to see him again. But before we get there, there's a robbery at the hotel store involving Chelsea, and she's pretty shaken up about it. But the robbers get away even though Guy Talk tries to stop them, so now the head of the security gets a gun to keep on hand. This is when we have to check back in with Timothy. So Timothy is now thinking of ways to take both he and his family out instead of just telling them what the hell is going on. And that's when he spots the gun that Guy Talk had left out when he got distracted talking to Book. But back to the girls trio. So Jacqueline, Kate, and Lori are now at some club with Fabian and his friends trying to relive their glory days, and it's pretty clear that Jacqueline loves attention, like she thrives off of it. She even sleeps with Fabian after spending that entire trip pushing him on Lori and acts like Lori is the crazy one when Lori calls her out on it. But things get really freaky between Chloe, Saxon, and Lachlan one night, and it left everyone feeling pretty weird except for Chloe, because now she's trying to recruit Saxon to have sex with Greg, who's really just gay but is probably using Chloe as a cover-up for some reason. But Saxon declines but comes to their party later that night, and so does Belinda, since Greg wanted to talk to her, but it turns out it was just to offer her 100K because she was worrying that entire time that he was probably going to kill her. So Guy Talk finally gets the gun back from Timothy. He sneaks into the room and takes it, but Timothy decides, you know what, since I can't find the gun's gone, I'm just gonna ground up these seeds, these poisonous seeds, for the family to drink instead. But he decides to leave Lachlan out of it because he was the only one of his children that said that he would be okay without their fancy living. Guy Talk finally figures out that it was Fabian and his friends that carried out the robbery at the hotel, and now he's wondering if he should just quit because of the morals and whatnot. He doesn't want to say anything in terms of Fabian and get his friends and him deported. But now Mook is losing her interest in him because of him wanting to quit. She thought he was going to be more ambitious. Belinda's son ends up coming for a visit, and he comes at a very awkward time, catches her in bed with that guy that she was training with. And Jacqueline finally apologizes for everything that she did, and Lori and Kate have a nice little cry session before leaving the room to take a picture with Sritala, who comes there with her husband, the owner, who Rick, just had that interaction with the night before. So Rick spots them, freaks out, and now wants to talk to that therapist again, but now she has a session with Belinda's son, who also managed to talk Greg into paying Belinda more money to stay quiet about the whole Tanya thing. Even though he technically didn't do anything to kill her, he was still involved, but at the end of it, she was the one that offed herself by accident on that boat in season 2. But anyways, Rick decides to just go up to Mr. Hollinger and shoot him a couple times. He dies in Sritala's arms, and that's when she reveals to Rick that he was actually Rick's father, and not the man that his mom had told him he had killed decades ago. But of course, he never gave him the chance to say that. Unfortunately, Chelsea gets caught in the crossfire and dies from her wound, but Rick still insists on finding help until Gatok shoots him from behind and he dies as well. But this would explain the gunshots that we hear in the beginning of the story. But back to the night before. So Timothy decides to change his mind on poisoning his family, but he forgets to clean out the remnants of the ground up poisonous seeds in the blender. The next morning, Lachlan decides to make one of those shakes that Saxon would kind of give him to drink, but doesn't wash out the blender. He just kind of drinks what's in there, which I've never really seen before. Who does that? That's kind of gross, but anyway. Victoria, Piper, and Saxon go to breakfast, not really realizing that Lachlan is basically dying. Timothy finds him keeled over and on the ground, realizing that he drank the seeds, and somehow Lachlan just comes back to life. So on the day everyone sails back to the mainland, Timothy finally comes clean to his family after acting super weird their entire vacation, and Belinda says goodbye to her boy toy, even though he did have hopes of them opening a spa together. But I don't really blame her for taking that $5 million and not really saying a word to him, because she barely knew that man. Now that's pretty much the end of the story, but in terms of my thoughts, I think compared to the other 2 seasons before it, it wasn't as interesting in terms of the plot. I think the other 2 had more of a strangeness factor to them, if that makes sense. Also, Rick was kind of infuriating. Like, how do you not have all the facts and just act on half-truths? Like, just make that make sense. But lastly, Chelsea really could have done better than Rick. That man would literally treat her like something that needed to be scraped off the bottom of his shoe. Like, the way he would talk to her and treat her was just absolutely crazy. And she'd just be like, oh, I'm trying to do better for you. Like, I'm trying to make you a better person. But the entire time I was like, please, no. Like, you're wasting your time. But yeah, I think she was one of those Delulu girls, but she was so sweet, but I feel like she could have found someone else. But I think overall this season was pretty slow, but even when it got to like the full build up and everything was kind of playing out, it was just kind of like, wasn't as great as season 1 and 2, but it was okay, But y'all let me know your thoughts on this one down in the comments. I'll be catching you all in the next video.